Welcome, part two, I would like to say, at least for today, to the first Global Gender and Migration Forum. We're gathered here today. It's the second day of the forum, and I'm very excited to welcome you to this second part of the double header that we have. I'm Dr. Lara-Zuzan Golesorkhi. I am the founder and executive director of the Center for Migration, Gender, and Justice, and we are the initiators of the first Global Gender and Migration Forum. And yesterday, in my opening speech to the opening of the forum, I said, let that sink in. It's the first one. Why do we have that now? Well, we're having it now, so this is a start. And I'm very excited on behalf of the entire team of the Center for Migration, Gender, and Justice to welcome you today. And again, kindly ask you to take a seat. I know there's a lot to be discussed, and we will have more time after this panel as well. And hopefully you've been able to connect. But we would like to transition now into the next panel. So please take a seat. I will start us off now with some opening remarks. Thank you. 1 in 3. 1 in 3, or nearly 30% of women worldwide, have experienced some form of gender-based violence. This means that there are likely women in this room that are survivors of gender-based violence, including myself. It doesn't have to be this way, and that's why we're here today. Gender-based violence is often a cause for migration. Women and girls, as well as LGBTQIA+ and gender diverse persons, leave their countries of origin to escape gender-based violence and other harmful related practices. Gender-based violence, however, also occurs along migratory routes and in destination countries. So what do we know about gender-based violence in displacement contexts? Here are 3 facts that I would like to share just to contextualize today's discussion. Fact 1, according to the UNHCR, 1 in 5 displaced women have experienced gender-based violence. This means that gender-based violence is pervasive across the migration continuum. Fact 2, this pervasiveness has made gender-based violence a priority area in many response plans, regional migrant, regional refugee response plans that operate under the UNHCR mandate and involve multi-partner and multi-sector response strategies, such as for operational and funding measures. Fact 3, yet, despite acknowledging this high risk of gender-based violence across the migration continuum and the high numbers of gender-based violence that we know of, not least the ones that go underreported, funding in humanitarian context does not match this need to address gender-based violence, as only 19% on average of gender-based violence-related funding requirements in humanitarian settings globally were met in 2022. This severe underfunding comes with a lack in range of funding recipients, which are mainly UN agencies and international non-governmental organizations, not national or local or community-based organizations that are doing the work on the ground. It is these dynamics and more that we will explore today in this panel, moderated by Dean Mostov, who I now have the honor of introducing. Julie Mostov is Dean and Professor of Liberal Studies. Her current scholarship focuses on the violence of closure, challenging the linkage of citizenship to national identity within hard border states. This work draws on her interrogation of the gendered politics of national identity and her arguments for soft borders and transnational citizenship. Publications related to these themes include her book, Soft Borders, Rethinking Sovereignty and Democracy, her co-edited volume, From Gender to Nation, and book chapters such as Soft Borders and Transnational Citizens, and Our Women, Their Women, symbolic boundaries, territorial borders, and violence in the Balkans. Dr. Mostov has served as a consultant for both the US and the EU during the breakdown of Yugoslavia and designed and implemented State Department grants in support of democratic transition and women's leadership in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Her earlier scholarship in democratic theory includes work such as Power Process and Popular Sovereignty, Endangered Citizenship, and Democracy and the Politics of National Identity. She came to NYU from Drexel University, where she was Senior Vice Provost for Global Initiatives and Professor of Politics. While there, she was recognized for her efforts to end gender-based violence globally and locally, including her long-term engagement with Women Against Abuse, Inc. as chair and member of the board. It is a great honor to have you here with us today, and thank you for joining us and moderating this important panel. I'll pass it now to you.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening.
Good evening.
Yeah, I know it's late, but if we all say good evening, we'll sort of wake up a little bit here. I'm just thrilled to be here. This is such an important event, and I want to thank the organizers for giving us a chance at Liberal Studies at NYU to be a part of such an important inaugural event. Lara-Zuzan, thank you very much. And to everyone else here, thank you. For me, this is a particularly important evening because it brings together scholars and practitioners, people who are working in the field, in the academy, together, which is so important. Those of us who understand the importance of working on gender-based violence when thinking about mobility, immobility, migration. When we begin to think about and understand this, the importance of this, we go back to looking at the ways in which the traditional gendered hierarchical binaries are really central to the hardening of borders and to exclusionary and authoritarian politics that we see today. The resurgence of contemporary populisms across the globe, and particularly gender-based violence in migration spaces and policies and practices. So I want us to think about the ways in which we analyze these gender-based hierarchies and binaries and the way in which we think about the practice that happens in the field. Bringing those two together, really fruitful for making a difference today in these spaces in the world. We have a number of excellent participants who will be discussing this work together with us tonight. And so I'm going to bring them up here right now. Cristina, Toro. Sorry, I didn't get a chance to meet you. Come on up, Cristina. Then Katherine Gambir. Cristina Dragomir. And Isha Mandal. Fantastic. Okay, I'm just going to, let's see, I was going to sit down, but I'll stand here for the moment and then I'll go sit down. Just going to say a few words about these folks. It's all on your website, and there's so much more to talk about, but just so you know who is at the table. So, Isha Mandal is a policy officer with expertise in multi-sector needs assessment and humanitarian situation monitoring. She's been in the field in Nigeria, Iraq, and will be going to Somalia. and let's see here. Um, and she leads the Migration, Peace, and Security Spotlight Project with an emphasis on regional responses, plans, and gender-based violence prevention, mitigation, and response at the Center for Migration, Gender, and Justice. So thank you for being with us here today. Okay, Cristina Dragomir, let's get the Cristina Dragomir is here. She is a clinical associate professor at NYU in liberal studies, and she specializes in global injustice, human rights, and migration patterns, and currently is doing a significant work investigating reasons behind migration in climate-affected communities, trying to understand the intersection between mobility and environmental challenges. Cristina, thank you. And then we have Katherine Gambir, who is an intersectional feminist humanitarian researcher, collaborating with diverse stakeholders across humanitarian development nexus to achieve gender equality and social justice. She's a senior researcher for gender equality inclusion at the Women's Refugee Commission, leading initiatives on addressing sexual violence among marginalized communities in humanitarian contexts. And we'll hear more about that and the project she leads, the Sexual Violence Against Men and Boys Project. Thank you. And finally, I know I have another person here, but where is it?
The first Cristina.
Yeah, but the first Cristina, did you send? I know it must be here somewhere. So,
Yeah.
the first, oh, thank you. No, I'm not finding. Okay, wait a minute. Cristina, I know I have you here, but for now, that's so weird. Okay. I know you're doing work on gender-based violence prevention, mitigation, and response with Venezuelan women and girls who are facing, along their migratory routes, are facing gender-based violence. And you're part of the your organization's digital observatory of femicide. That's what I have written here, unfortunately, but you'll tell us more, okay? Sorry about that. My fault. Okay, I'm looking forward to hearing more from them. And in order to facilitate this discussion, we're going to start with just a few questions, focusing on gender-based violence in displacement context this evening. I want to ask each of you to comment from your own perspectives and experience. How have you seen gender-based violence manifested? What forms of it are particularly prevalent, and in what spaces? And also, if you can think about this and then talk about some of the response measures that you have seen, the way that gender-based violence has been addressed either through prevention, mitigation, or other mechanisms, and whether there are any currently good practices that you have identified so far as effective. In the next round, I'll be asking you about what you think would be recommendations for more effective ones. But let's start with these two, and we'll begin. Why don't we begin at the beginning there with Isha? Thank you.
Yes, perfect. First off, thank you so much for having me here. It is truly an honor to be here, one, and then second, to follow up a panel that in very big details talked about the experiences of women, of migrant women, and of women in this society, in this structure of asylum seeking. So that is very powerful, and I'm very glad to follow up with that. As you may have heard, I have experiences, field experiences in the context of Nigeria, Iraq, and soon enough in Somalia. But beyond that, we've also been doing works in Djibouti. So that's a loaded question. There were a lot of questions, so bear with me here. I'll do my best to go through it. So first, how has GBV manifested? So in my experience working on the field, we see that within the context of, well, first, migrants, refugees, IDPs, asylum seekers, they have, their own set of complex issues, but, in CSW, in the international framework, we tend to group them together. So I'm following that framework. Already problem number one that I'm identifying. But some of the ways in which GBV has manifested throughout the context I've worked in is sexual violence, domestic violence, earlier forced marriages, FGM, to name a few. Now, we're short on time, so I'll start by my experiences with the CEDA review that we did with Center for Migration, Gender and Justice in the context of Djibouti. So what we saw in the terms of context, okay, maybe we're not all familiar with the context of Djibouti, but it hosts about 31,000 refugees, 11,000 asylum seekers, and it also has 150,000 undocumented migrants. And it also serves as a transit hub for the entire Horn of Africa. So this is the context that we're dealing with. And some of the findings show that in the displacement settings, such as refugee camps, such as temporary shelters, the risk of GBV is heightened due to overcrowding, lack of adequate security measures, limited access to resources, as we just heard in the previous setting. And we see that women and girls are particularly vulnerable in these contexts, as they are, the prime target, let's say, for trafficking, for sexual exploitation, for abuse in all of its form, physical, verbal, psychosocial. They also have, this does not just happen in the context of camps. Throughout the journey of displacement, there are things like survival sex that happen in the context that we're all familiar with. But when I say this, I would also want to highlight that there is currently no statistics when it comes to the LGBTQIA+ or the gender diverse migrants, IDPs, refugee, and that is problem number two that I'm highlighting here. So the second part of the context, second part of the question that was asked is what kind of prevention, mitigation, and response measures have there been? And, we talk about that. State governments have a lot to say. They want to include migrants. They are held responsible, as is Djibouti. They have signed multiple documents, both national and international, that are relevant and that promise the rights for women, girls, LGBTQIA+, gender diverse migrants. To even, sweeten the deal further, they have also submitted a voluntary national review on the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration and made 5 pledges for its implementation. Sounds pretty robust, right? And then with our GMI, the Gender Migration Index, we see the reality of it. So we did a very simple count. So in a 27-page long report, a state report submitted to CEDA, which is Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Any guesses how many times the word migration has been used or gender has been used? Take a guess. 5 times, that's it. And we have no references to asylum seekers, nothing about migrant sensitivity or inclusion. So that is just to paint you a picture in the sense that we have a lot of policy making. We have a lot of laws that are in place. I'm not saying they're robust. I'm not saying they're effective or, but we have some in places. But when it comes to implementation, there are none. Signing CEDAW, signing all of these conventions that we have, states do that. They ratify that. I mean, just to put in the context, the country that we're currently in has not signed it. But even then, the other countries that have ratified it, implementation is still lacking. So I think I'll stop here and give a chance for my other panelists to speak about it, and then we'll get back. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Cristina.
Thank you, Dr. Mostov. And just to clarify, I have the pleasure of speaking at 2 events this week, so I might have submitted my details only to one event. So
That's
it might
what I
not be
couldn't
your
find.
fault, but mine that with the presentation. So my name is Cristina Ciordia. I work for the Center for Justice and Peace, and it's the story of our organization answers this question that we've been asked in a way, right? We are a Venezuelan NGO, and we started working in Venezuela promoting peace culture and democratic values through a gendered lens. This is the beginning of the organization. And then the Venezuelan migrant crisis happened, which is something that might be in your collective minds from 2020 onwards. We have been speaking about this since 2015 at the very least. Currently, the Venezuelan mobility crisis is the second largest mobility crisis in the world. Almost 8 million people have left our country, myself included, since approximately 2015, 2016, due to the complex humanitarian emergency. So our work, which was originally nationally based, had to start incorporating. We're a human rights organization, and we had to start realizing that advocating for the human rights of Venezuelan people and of Venezuelan women now included women abroad. One of the things that we already did back home was to have this digital observatory of femicides, which tries to partially cover one of the big or most difficult hurdles that we have back home, which is the absolute lack of data. And I'll take a pause here and say that lack of data or lack of properly disaggregated data is a problem basically everywhere. But there is a difference between what is not being measured due to capacity and the opacity policies of the Venezuelan government. One of the reasons that we can say this so vehemently is because we also had a CEDAW review last year. And in this CEDAW review, Venezuelan civil society heard for the very first time numbers of victims of gender-based violence, which we had never heard before, are not accessible in any sort of government website, cannot be requested in any sort of government entity. We heard for the first time about plans to handle human trafficking that have never been published, are not available in any sort of official capacity back home. So there is an important policy of opacity, which makes answering this question difficult, because what we rely on is essentially what is available through digital media and what other countries report back in terms of the number of Venezuelan, in this case women, that they are now receiving in shelters, in violence response mechanisms. And this has created a patchy source of information. But one thing has really shone across, and that is the clear-cut answer to how has gender-based violence manifested in the context that I am familiar with, and that is human trafficking. Venezuela currently has, according to the Walk Free initiative, the highest numbers of modern slavery in the region, and over 90% of those numbers correspond to women and girls who are being trafficked for sexual exploitation. So as migration becomes increasingly harder for Venezuelan people, and people start traveling through or across increasingly more dangerous routes, trafficking just increases exponentially. This, in the last year's CEDAW review, this was one of the 3 priority areas that the committee identified as something that the Venezuelan government needed to address urgently. And Isha was just mentioning how important it is to see this gap that exists between what looks robust in terms of documents signed and pledges made versus reality. In our case, we have a complete denial of the problem and the situation. The Venezuelan government has referred to the numbers of migration as an act of great creativity by the United Nations. So, I mean, if we cannot even name this problem, we are obviously very, very far away from solving it. So any best practices that we can speak of have or exist within countries in the migratory route. I think that if one idea answer would be safe passage, countries that actually do what they can to provide safe passage for people are where we see the lowest rates of human trafficking. However, as I said, the information is patchy, and I cannot confidently say that this is numerically where the biggest impact is, but it is where we are seeing the most increase, and it's scary.
Thank you. Thank you. Katherine.
Thank you so much, Katherine Gambir. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a senior researcher at the Women's Refugee Commission. We're also co-hosting the event this week. Wow, I mean, this question I think is really hard to answer because I work in a very global context. We work all over the world. So oftentimes we hear at these events, it's context specific, and like context really does matter. However, in each context, all forms of violence, right? Like emotional, physical, sexual, economic, denial of resources. This is happening everywhere. It's happening right outside our doors, right? So even one case of GBV is not acceptable, right? And it deserves to have attention and for funding to be allocated and resources and advocacy to end it, right? Something else is also, when I think about this question, it's like, okay, but, yes, the what is GBV, forms of GBV, and then who's at risk, right? And we also think about gender-based violence, which I think I'll talk a bit more, and Lara mentioned, right? Like it's, we often think about gender-based violence and women and girls for good reason, because the evidence shows, right, that women and girls experience all forms of gender-based violence at higher levels. There's also this binary approach, though, when we say women and girls, right? So where do people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, gender expressions, and sex characteristics fit into this equation, right? And I often think about youth, right, even in the US, and it's non-binary, gender fluid. Like this obviously doesn't just exist in the US, it's global and everywhere. So I'm really, and there's different risk profiles, right? Different ways how people will be at risk for different forms of violence, depending on those diversity characteristics as well as others, right? When we think about people who are crisis affected, but then we think about people in their host country and then people who are migrants, right? They don't maybe have access to government social services and safety nets. They are away from home, their social and family support systems, access to health services, documentation for working, right, which we learned about in the previous session. So it's really, it's also when we talk about violence, it's often, we see it in the news media, thinking of Ukraine, Gaza, Palestine, right? It's, and Israel, it's, sexual violence comes up, right? I mean, no pun intended, it's the sexy kind of thing, right? It's used as, and we know it happens, right? It's happened since Darfur, and now we're seeing in Tigray, Ethiopia. It is an egregious human rights violation. It deserves that attention, right? I mean, we've seen rape as a weapon of war forever. At the same time, it's sometimes that kind of the niche, and then it goes away, right? At the same time, there's various forms of violence that are occurring. And we actually, which we do through our research, talk with displaced people, communities, understand their risk to GBV, their experience, their coping mechanisms to inform appropriate quality, timely response. GBV is not only on the headlines, right? It's, as I think Lara mentioned, it's, IPV, intimate partner violence. This is occurring, denial of resources, access to educational opportunities. And this occurs before even a crisis happens a lot of times, right? Because when we think about, okay, what is the root causes of gender-based violence? That's gender inequity and abuse of power, right? So it doesn't just, one day parents wake up and say, okay, we're in a crisis, we're gonna, marry our daughter, right? Like these social norms are already in place, and then there's crisis hits and there's a push and pull, right? The push factors may be, okay, well now we have to decide that, I have 5 children, I'm going to marry my daughter, so there are more, less mouths to feed, right? And there's also very specific, through humanitarian aid, there's very specific pushes. And that could even be like what we've seen in Nepal after the earthquake, in the Philippines, Mindanao. It's the humanitarian architecture where in order to, each household basically receives a food packet distribution, right? So if you're creating a new family by marrying your daughter, that essentially is spreading out the resources through their family. And it's oftentimes, interestingly enough, in terms of, trends, when we look at child marriage, we've also been seeing in Zimbabwe, the Philippines, and in Nepal, actually adolescent-initiated child marriages. So, and there it's interesting, right? Because they're having agency in their decision making. So we're like, okay, great, like adolescent girls, yes, you're making decisions, but oh, this is the wrong decision, right? So they're like, that's taken away. Okay, but not that. And really, it's they're experiencing, again, it's the social norms in their home, right? They're saying, well, I'm experiencing, I'm being abused at home, whatever that means to them, being denied of resources. And actually this option of marrying this guy who just came back from South Africa and, has money, and maybe I can go to South Africa for work. That's looking pretty good to me, right? It's like, I want to get out of this home, and, there's ambitions and aspirations that don't always come to fruition. Okay, so this is why I should have taken notes, because I will talk forever.
Yes, I was going to say,
okay,
maybe we can come
Let's
back
move.
to you. Yes. Okay, thank you. Very interesting. And but let's go to Cristina, and then we'll circle around again.
Hi, so thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dean Mostov, and thank you, Lara-Zuzan, for having us here. And thank you to my colleagues. So I will echo a lot of what our colleagues have said, but I will share with you that I come to gender-based violence and migration from a different angle, and that is from that includes the nexus of climate change and environmental disasters. So I entered not through GBV into this, but through climate displacement. And I really appreciated how Lara-Zuzan and her colleagues framed the encounters that we have in the context of displacement. And I'll tell you why, right? And so again, echoing what my colleagues have said earlier, I would like to add another dimension to where we can see GBV, and that is structural. Because we can see a lot of this being manifested at the structural level. And one particular area that is of interest to me, particularly with respect to climate migration, is the legal aspect to it, because that's where we see this formulated when we see people being included or excluded from the framework. So GBV, as my colleagues have said, of course, it takes forms that are very powerful and identifiable, such as sexual violence, but of course denial of resources, and moreover, the accountability of the humans as well, right? So Isha have told us, and then Cristina also emphasized the same thing, that there are people who we do not know, right? We do not have them in the reports. We have these women missing. We have the LGBTQ people missing. We do not have them as a part of our structures, of our understanding, of our knowledge. And that's where I come to realize this. And we'll talk a little bit further when more specific questions will come into place. But I noticed this as I was looking at patterns of mobility and immobility in the context of climate change, because we talk about people moving or being displaced and actually being on the move. But a really important part of the migration process, it's also the people who are left behind without the structures of support, without the people that they are in their networks, maybe without their mothers, without their sisters, without so many of the people that they can count for. And that leads to a certain immobility, and that's not only physical, but it's manifested in all areas of the society, from immobility in terms of accessing education, from accessing healthcare, and so on and so forth. And in my work, trying to understand the patterns of mobility and immobility, of climate displacement, I have noticed that this data is thoroughly missing. We do not know what we do not know, right? Like, we do not know the number of women. We do not know who are they. We do not know where they are, especially within the context of climate migration. Many of the people do not cross borders. And because they do not cross borders, it's extremely difficult to count them as a result of it. So then we see these black holes of knowledge, of legal systems, of policy that do not and are not able to recuperate people. So I'm happy to talk a little bit further about my own experience, but we'll go back to.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, I think that we can see very clearly in the responses that we have heard so far some of the reasons why responses to gender-based violence are so weak. And in addition to the total denial of governments, there are also the problems of data missing, structures for data collection and recognition, the total erasure of people. I think that's very important. At the same time, the ways in which collection of data, but data which is impossible to gain, can also become part of the problem. And then, of course, we have the intersectional aspect of race, ethnicity coming into play. Who are the people who are being erased, and who are the people who are finding themselves protected or receiving some sort of resources? And of course, I think gender itself is part of that. And Wade, we've talked about some issues around gender fluidity and those categories. But we need to bring carefully and importantly race and ethnicity, religion into play there as well. And then again, we have to ask the question about which and whose notions of violence are highlighted. And I think that's really important that you discuss child marriage. Always the first one we pop up to, or which people's cultural values are under target, and how do they play into ways in which we want to demonize certain people and migrants. So I think that this is something that all of you have alluded to, and really important for us as we begin to unpack some of these questions about why have the responses been so weak, and why do we know so little. So I'd like to go back and ask each of you to think about what kind of recommendations in the context that you're working that you might pose, and then that will help us, I think, flesh some of this out. Shall we begin in the same order? Is that okay, Isha?
Yes,
Thank you.
it's good. Can you hear me? Perfect. So the word data has been thrown around quite a few times in this panel, in CSW in general. That's the new buzzword, if I may. And I am the one with data. You see it. I like my data. I work with data. So more specifically, I work with multi-sectoral needs assessment. What does that mean? So, we get all of these funding. It comes from the taxpayers' money, but where does it go? Like, of course, you give it to this agency. In the US, it's Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs. And then you give it to the UN organizations that further subcontract it to others. And, that's where it goes. And that's where data collection comes from. Why am I giving you this context? I mean, it's data, right? No, it's not. When it comes to GBV, when I work every single day, I'm here in the panel, so I have a very much vested interest in trying to bring out this gender disaggregated data. But let me just walk you through some of the complexities. One, we're talking about data in the context of a very sensitive topic, GBV. You can't just, walk up somewhere where you see in the context of Venezuela where the government doesn't even recognize it exists. So one, you can't have a standard set of questionnaire just going country to country asking questions. Second, people are actually suffering. They have been through something. So if you go and ask questions in a non-sensitive matter, you further re-traumatize them, and that is the last thing we need. So in these contexts, we need trained people that can do it. We need context specific, and that takes time and resources. And yes, we keep talking about gender disaggregated data, and I for sure have an interest in it. But something that lacks is one, the budget for it, and like, okay, every time we just speak about money, right? We're like, okay, if there is money, we put the resources there, but what until then? Okay, eventually we want that money and we do a representative nationwide census kind data. But until then, what do we do? Do we just sit and do nothing, just keep talking about data in GBV for years to come? Absolutely not. So we're trying to think about a solution, what can be done. And okay, I'm sitting down here as a data person who does data, so maybe it's my job. But then what is the point of everyone sitting here in this room? Are you just here to listen about the data that I talk about in my statistically representative language? No? So I have tried to bring up a solution with you within the context of Center for Migration, Gender, and Justice. So we've created this tool that is called a Gender Migration Index that I had spoken about during my first intervention. So what it does is that it acts as a guidance indicator tool. We use a traffic light system. But another thing that comes up is just numbers. Asylum seekers, refugees, IDPs have just become numbers to us. And we also have this very strong narrative about we need their lived experiences. How do we capture that? Well, look no further, you have GMI. So what we do is this, in this very context-specific traffic light system, we use an indicator system to capture this gender diverse migrants, which is aligned with the international review processes and provides criteria for benchmarking policy. So it sounds complex, but it really is not. So let me just walk you through a very quick example. So you look at a document. First thing, Control F, migrants. How many times does it show up in the thing? Gender, women, very easy things to do. And then, okay, what is the use of that? You see how little that number is. In a 27-page document, it shows up 5 times. What does that mean? They're using the logic of add gender and mix, add women and mix, just, here and there, and then you see, like, okay, I've done my part, no accountability. So from a very small thing, you see that happen. Second, when we bring in civil societies, practitioners like you, be it academic, be it from the migrant organizations, the communities, then you bring in the lived experiences. We do a tally of 2 things. We look at the state reports, but we also look at the reality on the ground. So when we come together and we volunteer our time here, and then we bring these 2 experiences together, we come up with something that is already very robust in a reality where data is lacking. I'm not saying this is a permanent solution. I'm saying this is a start. So let's start there. Let's not wait until the data is there and someone comes up and it's like, here is statistically represented data and consensus. And I'm sure someone will again come up with the context of, well, what is the confidence level? So let's not get into statistics. Let's do what we can. That's where I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Isha's provided me with great segues. I love this. She said, well, maybe I'm the data person and maybe this is my job. While we do what we can, she'll be working on the data. I'd like to tell you what I think my job is and try to answer this question that for me had this 2 points of data and recommendations. And there was a very important question being highlighted about who is being erased. So in the intersection of all of that, here's what I think my job is. I think my job is to break through silos, because there are people gathering data and making recommendations about too many different separate things, and it creates this patchy quilt that I've been referring to. And the answers that we are trying to come up with are always missing the point just a little bit. There's a blind spot just like left of where you need it. And I see my work as trying to barrel through all of these things. For example, we have a fact-finding mission, like a UN fact-finding mission in Venezuela, and they have produced several important reports. One of them really centered on the disasters happening in our southern border figures with sexual exploitation of indigenous women. So we have this like uber disaggregated data in a sense, right? In which we know specifically everything that's happened exactly to this woman in this place. But we have no idea how that fits into the larger context of what we understand gender-based violence in our country to be, or gender-based violence in the context of the mobility of these women, which, because they are part of this indigenous group that is a binational Brazilian Venezuelan indigenous group, has a interesting migration pattern that frequently we don't even take into account because we don't consider that migration. This is a binational nation. So breaking through the silo of understanding this particular reality versus the data we gather with the Digital Observatory of Femicides versus the information that the government provides to CEDAW and the answers that different people are trying to provide to each of those particular things is what we try to do. And we don't pretend to do it ourselves. We work in networks. We try to find, and that's something that was also brought up in the previous panel that I thought was very important, which is saying like there are people that know what to do for this and that and this, and that they're already doing it properly. So what we try to do is empower and connect these networks so that we can break through these silos that have different patchy bits of data and different specific recommendations, which all separately kind of don't completely work. But if we try and see them together, we might get a little bit closer to something that looks like a solution.
Great, thank you. Katherine.
Thank you. And I'll keep it shorter this time, I promise. I have so much to say about also like the research methodologies and data. Back to recommendations. I mean, especially since COVID-19, right? We have seen a push in the humanitarian sector towards anti-racist, feminist frameworks and towards localization, right? So we saw that, frontline workers were community leaders, right? Community health workers. I think that is the direction we're going, and we should, right? Like that's feminist. That's a feminist forward-thinking direction. Along with that, when it, as we think about, okay, recommendations for GBV prevention and response, who have been the leaders doing this all along, forever, who knows their community, right? Has lived experiences of GBV. This is women-led feminist organizations who have been fighting this fight for so long. They understand their communities and their needs and those affected by crisis and GBV. So, recommendations, my recommendations, we would ask them, what are your recommendations to improve this it's a broken system. It's a broken colonialist system. So recommendations would be to ask women-led feminist organizations, what resources, what gaps, what do they need, right, to really lead this work forward? So why are they best placed to do this work? Well, as women-led organizations, feminist organizations, what's the root cause of gender-based violence? Gender inequality and abuse of power, right? That's exactly what women-led feminist organizations are fighting for or fighting against. And they understand the social fabric, norms, and community. Alongside that, I think it's also, if we think about sustainability, localization and sustainability, it's also working with national governments, right? And more of an onus on prevention, not only on, crisis response, humanitarian, INGOs go in and then they leave, right? And then, women-led organizations are still fighting the fight, and the national governments, right? So we need really coordinated systems between governments and civil society organizations. And that includes LGBTQI plus led organizations. And we talked a little bit about that previously. I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Cristina.
Yeah, thanks to all of you. And again, specifically to Katherine, because I'm going to follow exactly on that. So I think that a lot of great work has been done, as you have heard from my colleagues here, with doing a lot of work on the ground with specific communities and interrogating and collecting data. So, and we do know a lot, right, about GBV. We know a lot. and we meet and we talk and we discuss this and we interrogate. One actor that I feel that it's continuously missing at these tables are the people in power. Who can actually produce those kind of changes. And those are the people that we really need to start asking questions to and hold them accountable and hold their feet to the fire, because they need to be answering those tough questions, right? We already know the data is already there. We've been working, we have women from the community, we have representatives from LGBTQ who can provide that rich data. We have it all, right? We should start in a way kind of driving in a different direction and incorporating those in power and those who can actually make those changes. So in addition to everything that you said, that I think is very important and it's absolutely mandatory for this to happen, is to incorporate the national and local governments, but also very importantly, the international organizations. And I know it's great to have UN and IOM on the panels and so on, but I have been to COP28 discussing migration and climate change, and they just, and I know they have their own pressure, and I'm very considerate and mindful of that, of the internal pressure, but they come and tell us the same thing again and again and again. And I think it's time to ask those tough questions at the level of the international organizations as well, about what is actually happening and put them at the same table with everybody. So this will be my addition to the thoughts that I had.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let me sort of go to the other end of the question. And all of you have worked in the field. But what has been your experience? I think you're right when you say, Katherine, ask organizations, ask the people who have been working in the field. So all of you have worked with stakeholders. What are the women that you're speaking with? What are they saying? Have you had those kind of conversations, and where is their voice? How can we make their voices heard? So yes, we need to hold accountable people in power, but at the same time, we need to hear more of the voices of the people on the ground. How are there ways, have you been able, some ways, yes, you've talked about data and so on. Any other things that you can tell us from your experience working in the field?
Sure. So yes, there are ways, we just talk about giving voices to people. It's not our voices to give. Let's start the discussion there. We just need to sit down and hear and give them the safe space. We're talking about protection that is another problem. We talk about GBV under protection. You have this massive umbrella where you put child protection, where you put HLP, housing, land and property, and GBV under the same context. There's already that problem. So again, going back to the idea that, there are so many voices that are put together in the same room that it kind of gets lost. So what needs to be done is go seek out that voice and give it a platform, give it the safe space. What I mean by that is, yes, could be jargons. These can be buzzwords. But what I found has worked particularly in my context, which is in Nigeria and Iraq, is have women-led enumerators. So these are people from the same society or from the same camps that they're operating in. We train them, we give them the right skills. We always talk about local approaches, but they also need to be equipped with with the right skills, because yes, they know the context, but do they know how to handle it in the way and in the in the sensitive manner that is needed? So that's where we come in to do that. And then to lead focus group discussions. Don't go to women, single them out and be like, tell me about everything. We do not do that there. You are actually putting them on the spot, not just in terms of harm in the context of individually, but also in the context of community. We work in an honor framework, in a traditional setting, which has implications beyond themselves, beyond their family, beyond their community. So this is something that you need to tailor the approach to. So something that has worked for me with my field is having women-led discussions from the ground in a focus group discussion. When you let them know that you're here to talk to them, tell them you are there to collect data from them, tell them how this data is going to be used, what is your priority? What is your plan of dissemination? Don't just go there for the sake of collecting data and do nothing about it. So go there with a plan. I would say create a safe space for them and then just listen to them. You don't have to do anything. They know what they're talking about. They've lived through the experience. I can sit down here and pretend that I know about all of these theories, but I know nothing about the ground reality. I have never, I don't know the road. I am a migrant, so maybe in that way I have some experiences, but that is just to build solidarity. So yeah, it's just that easy. Sit down, listen, create that safe space for them if you have the resources, but if not, just have that empathy in you and listen. That's what I.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I could just say retweet, but I'm going to add a tiny, very recent story. So we recently sat virtually with a group of Venezuelan human rights defenders, and this is a very different type of gender-based violence that I will refer to now, just to clear that out, because this is an election year in Venezuela too, and there's increased rates of repression going on, and we recently had this important, and it's a very long story. The fact is that we sat down with this group of women defenders, and one of them said, like, look, you know what? I would really like us to talk about how, this was a few weeks ago, how this increase in repression, there's this word in Spanish that I don't know how to translate, nos interpela. Like, it's basically how this is different for us than it is for them, right? Like how we feel this differently. There was this defender, they took her when she was with her daughter, and then they took 5 of her family members. So how that feels differently for a caretaker, which is overwhelmingly women in the Venezuelan in all contexts, but in Venezuela, which is what I know about. And I said, okay, great, we should do a panel and we should have show how this is different and talk about like differentiated effect. And she was like, no, I kind of want this to be a conversation between us. Like we want to, I want to hear how she's doing. I want to hear whether she feels comfortable taking her kids to school now. And I was like, okay, so, and we took a poll. Do we want this to be a private conversation, or do we want this to be a panel type thing in which we teach people what it means to be a woman right defender? And people said, no, actually, we want this to be a conversation amongst ourselves. So the only reason I'm bringing the story up is because I feel like it shines a light on what Isha was saying, which is just like, don't go there with an agenda. Don't go there thinking that you're going to lead the conversation in a specific direction that's going to produce an outcome. Just listen, and people will tell you what they need, and you can do what's in your hands to provide that for them.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, Katherine.
Yeah, I really appreciate also that anecdote. I mean, it's along the lines as well as what I was going to mention about, we don't go in and just ask, oh, have you experienced sexual violence in the past 12 months, which is like on the demographic. Anyways, so, and by the way, like most of those nationally represented surveys where we get a lot of our data and policymakers do are not representative of migrants, right? Or refugees and asylum seekers. So they're definitely an overlooked population, obviously. And I wanted to share another example of an innovative research methodology that is very participatory that we used among food insecure communities in Zimbabwe and among crisis affected and displaced communities in the Philippines. It's been used as well among Syrian refugees. It's called SenseMaker. So it's a data collection and analysis tool, mixed methods, whereby using a tablet device, like a phone, a tablet, the enumerator will record a participant's story. It's called a micro narrative. It's supposed to be like a really small, like kind of they call it a water cooler story, like catching up with a friend. And you use a very open-ended question. So although our research objective, right? And I mean, I think you mentioned a good point, like don't go in there with an agenda, but for human subject research with, marginalized populations, like we need to go through an IRB that requires all the tools, all the questions we're going to ask, the whole design, analysis plan, everything. but even so, yes. So we asked the question in the Philippines, although we wanted to understand what are the drivers of child marriage in this community, what was your experience, and so forth. Instead, we asked, what is it like for young people to grow up here? Right, a very, very open-ended question, right? It's not forcing any GBV, child marriage disclosure, which was, very sensitive, especially for people outside of the community to come in, right, to your homestead or your village to ask you those questions, such sensitive questions. And also, it was at the household level, right? You could have parents or, your husband there and so forth. 1/3 of the stories after our thematic analysis, 1/3 were about child marriage, right? So even just that statistic, you're asking, what is it like to grow up here? 1/3 of the stories, we captured almost 2,000 stories. About half of them were from adolescents under or 13 to 19 years old, about child marriage, right? So that's definitely an opportunity where you create the space through, ethical research methods, having if you're talking to a girl or woman, a female, for men and boys, you want to ask them, like they could also not feel comfortable talking to a man. And anyways, all these other, you create that space and actually in GBV research, I also don't want us to be afraid like, oh, we can't ask about GBV, because actually the literature there is that, if you do create that space, that safe, psychologically and physical safe space, it's survivors have shared, it's actually, it can be cathartic. Like some want to share their story, right? So you offer a safe space to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's again a really good sequence. So I'm a social scientist by training, so I'm an academic. So I do have other limitations and other points of entry. So one of them is when you need to publish your work, they ask you how many interviews you've done, right? Like that's one of the things that they ask you. And what I've learned, and again, I enter in the field of working through the GBV studies by working on migration, right? So in my experience, when I have experience, particularly in India, working, and in Romania, where I'm originally from, I go there and I start a conversation with one woman, but suddenly another woman comes in the middle and the third one joins, and so on and so forth, right? So this idea that we have, according to national statistics and so on, that I'm interviewing this person and these are all their answers and so on, it's completely flawed. But it's something that it's so challenging to the very structure of how we do social science and how we account for certain people and so on, right? So I would echo what was said earlier, what Isha said in terms of focus groups. But in my fieldwork, I'm thinking about them as community interviews, where a lot of people are coming, and sometimes in spaces that are very that are not very typical of conducting interviews, because sometimes public spaces would attract people who would pose the danger to those who are willing, and you're right, for some people it's absolutely cathartic and they want to share those stories, right? So just to give you some examples, at one point in a nomadic community that I've been working with for some years, women literally physically took me away from where I was, leaving everybody behind, like all of the other research assistants and so on, and took me into one of their shelters and locked all the doors. And that's where they put on music, and they created this space where they thought I was very unkempt because my hair was unruly. So they were undergoing this ritual for them, and that's where they shared. But again, this idea that what we have to create are sometimes those physical spaces. And I have just recent experience in applying for very prestigious but also very official grants. And when you apply for them, it's really difficult to explain to people that we're gonna go into women's kitchens. And that's the space where we are talking about, right? Because they want you to like give all of these answers that the readers of those things are used to, right? And I, with my colleagues who are very open-minded and really wonderful and brilliant, I have to tell them, and at first when they looked at my proposal, my side of the proposal, they were like, I think there's a mistake here. You said that we're gonna go into women's kitchens, into kitchens, right? And I said, but where do you think the women are? Like, isn't that an imposition from us to expect that women, especially women who come from certain economic impoverished areas, especially in refugee camps and so on, you expect them to like take 3-4 hours of childcare and household and other kind of work that they do just to like talk to us for nothing? Like, this makes no sense, right? Like, we are like overburdening this population. So being mindful even of this like space creation, of community creation, and also I cannot emphasize enough what was said earlier about listening to them. When I was working with a nomadic community, I didn't speak their language, and I had a male translator at that particular time. And there was a woman that kept coming to me and showing me her arms, right? And that was a story that she really needed to be told, but everybody was pushing her aside. Like, nobody else in the community wanted her to share the story. So sometimes it takes a little bit more in like pushing through those boundaries and pushing those limitations to actually have access, to have the trust of the people, but also have the trust of the community that you can go and have those conversations later on in those kind of spaces. But for that to happen, my worry is that we really need to work at the structural level within social science and find those spaces where we can challenge those assumptions about what good research is and what valuable research is, and incorporate this kind of stories coming up from the ground and community work wherever we can and however we can, even though it's not easy to challenge structures and stuff.
That's why we have to break down our own silos, and this evening is a good example of that, of how we do that. It also speaks to something that I constantly am telling my students, and that is you must learn languages. You cannot work with people and not know languages. Of course, sometimes we don't know, how many languages can we learn? We can use translation, but it makes a huge difference for those of us who have worked speaking with people in their own languages. I think it's time for questions. We've had such a rich conversation, and I know that there are probably some people in the audience here. We've already gone over time, but I was told that I could go a little bit over. So let's see if we could collect a couple. Maybe I'll collect 3 questions and then give them. Yes.
Well,
Yes.
let's continue on. Sadness, those essential with you support.
No. So the context in which I mentioned this particular group was the report that was done by the fact-finding mission, just so on the human rights violations taking place in this region, which actually comprises at least 4 or 5 different indigenous groups. This is our largest land border. We do not work directly with this population. Actually, no, NGOs cannot even fathom entering these territories because they're heavily controlled by the military. And all of the information that we have was gathered in Brazil. In Venezuela, this is not something that anyone who is not wearing like a green military uniform can even think of entering these spaces. So unfortunately, no, there is nobody who can work with these communities in their territory. Those who do work on the Brazilian side, and it's complicated to determine, as I mentioned, because they're a binational nation, to determine if you're servicing, so to speak, Venezuelan nationals or Brazilian nationals, But we do know that whatever is happening is taking place on the southern side of the border and not within our country, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. In like Yemen's directive, what Yemen meant, you know, Olympic Games that not once to have it. There is a political thumbnail that set of things. And Yata, you said of it. Out is led to lock his body and silence and ignore the United Nations. Needness of humanitarian little bodies, silence without his voice, said he. Smart.
Pretty.
Let's, we'll come back to that. People think about it. I'll collect two more questions. Yeah. Yeah, Dina, sorry.
I have a couple of one question about any comment. Next, the question is for Cristina, which is, and I watched say if you were an anthropologist, you would always be an
The political scientists.
You're not supposed to go in with an agenda. You're supposed to go in with well, then theorize about what they said. So maybe change this thing.
Or maybe change I forgot to say I'm trained in politics, right? So that's why or maybe just challenge politics as a field with anthropological means, right?
And I think you said that about being an anthropologist, that not the next day will necessarily have any policy. And I think that's part of news. One of the things about doing research is that when you do research, when you are on this, you immediately enough will research is supposed to have immediate policy implications. That's when the numbers, that's when you have to find something out, it costs knowledge for itself, and to manage it off very narrow and reluctant. Right? So there is something worth thinking about there. But my question to you is about virus migration. So how do you know when something is, I bet teach you that climate life doesn't go through something else. So it runs lots of people leave places, they have been leaving places parts of river eroding. I wouldn't say that's necessarily, that's never been called climate migration until recently. Climate migration has become a kind of label, very handy label, right? More things that have been happening, and I think it's not really about it's just something I'm just curious on that. Actually, my question is actually, it comes up from what Jane Mostov was saying about violence and what comes with violence and kinds of violence that are, accepted as violence and who does violence. It doesn't get to the other that too, because it's really easy. We can think about sexual violence as violence, but what about the violence of capitalism? What about the violence of structural adjustment? What about the violence of girls who have, I think, follows on child marriage, very sick. But we want the violence of girls who feel they have no future, and they have romances. They're not even supposed to. They're young. They're 16-year-old love. Okay, they realize they have this one little woman light in their lives, and they need their lives. Their parents have been increasing the policy. And this whole idea of partial feminism, I think that if you're going to think about GDP as any fund, you also really need to think about
Too late. Okay, I was about to end. Policy, violence. And the final thing, and this is just a comment to what was just said, that other question is, it's very interesting that one side's violence is recognized as violence and other sides isn't. And I think actually the power relations are quite reversed. I mean, it's interesting. The UN actually, has a report on this. There is this Pramila Patten was there, has a report
on it. Israel has allowed her to go in. It hasn't allowed any other people to go into Gaza, for that matter, for other kinds of very real violence that women in Gaza are facing, including reproductive violence.
Other questions? Okay, so I'll let people respond, and I think that we'll wrap it up. To any of the questions.
So I guess this idea about who coins the terms GBV. I mean, this goes back to yes, exactly. What does it entail? How is it manifested? How do we recognize them? Who are we to recognize? I think all of this goes back to the structure that is created, and for now we are bound by this structure. Should we keep being bound by it? Definitely not. And I think this is something I invite all of us to think about it. But what I can speak from my background in international law and international criminal law is that for now, that is where the code of conduct comes from. And I mean, let's all reflect who coined this code of conduct, right? So, I mean, there are a lot of different conversations to have, a lot of different systematic orders that have been in place for a long time. And I think we're broadening the scope of these crimes, these activities, slowly. But I mean, if you want to talk specifically in the context of international criminal law and Rome Statute itself, you see how limited it is and what is recognized, what is not recognized. And it's very political. At the end of the day, it really is. There is no diplomatic way to say it. It's who coined these terms, who came together to bring about this manifesto. I mean, it is manifesto at the end of the day. So I think it's politics, but we do live in a democracy for now. So let's use that. Let's use the voices. Let's try what we can do. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
Can I follow up on what Isha said? I think that actually relates to your question about climate migration and the underpinnings of that, because you're right that we use the term climate migrants, climate refugees, climate IDPs left and right. But the truth is we do not have a legal framework for it. And we do not have at the international level, we do not have any way to actually address climate migration, climate IDPs, and so on. And this is a political process. This is not something that can be done without the political and international engagement into this. And there are real repercussions on this. So as I said, I came to the topic of GBV through climate migration. And that's because of what I've seen in a community that was hit by the environmental disaster in Romania. Where women were carrying the burden not only of climate disaster, because they were left behind by the men that were moved away, and were facing multiple ways of violence, but also because of the fact that while I was working there and I tried to reach out to the local government, to the national government, and to an international organization, there was actually no way for them to be recognized. There was no way for them to be counted. When I reached out to IDPs, internally displaced organization, they told me the community is too small to count, literally. And therefore, there were absolutely none. So I agree with you. This is not an easy way to define them. And as we have definitions and legal means to address so many things, especially in the International Court of Justice and so on, this is one of the things that we need to come and think together about this. This is not something that I can create or can be created overnight. This is a part of a very large and tedious conversation that needs to happen.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe just a few points to add on, and also related to our conversations around data, right? And we've mentioned earlier around, the importance of naming things, and also like who's creating these structures, right? And it's really, as you said, I mean, policy, law, the economy, right? The international political economy. These are structural and patriarchal systems, right? They're not designed for marginalized communities, including women and girls, people with diverse socioeconomic. I mean, dismantling those systems is important. Obviously, we can't solve that, anytime soon. But in doing so, it's also in through data and like listening to refugees, displaced people. It's, and which we ask, like, we try to, through participatory methods, understand what is your understanding of gender-based violence. When we conducted participatory focus group discussions with first Venezuelan migrants in Colombia and La Guajira, the understandings among the Wayu community were, someone going against their like gender norms or expectations in the community, right? So a woman would be like speaking out against her husband, and then they would call that gender-based violence, right? Are they wrong? What? Like, it's not for us to say, right? Like, as researchers, we want to be understanding the phenomenon and their community from their perspectives. That's what it is, right? Oh boy, that's not answering our research question. What do we do now, right? So I think it's, also when we're talking about like multi-sectoral assessments, I would and quantitative research for sure is really understanding and working with communities through civil society organizations to understand, we shouldn't be the ones determining the protocol and the agenda and the outcomes that we wish to see because the donor wants it, right? It's really working with communities to understand what are your goals, right? What are your needs and priorities? And sometimes GBV, SRHR, right, is not necessary. Family planning is super, super important. Sometimes it's not the first step, right? Sometimes it's, I need food on the table. I need livelihoods, right? So it's something else to consider.
So I guess I'm closing up here. But I like feeding off what other panelists are saying, because I think that what you just mentioned of, okay, so if this is what they consider gender-based violence to be, are they wrong? I think that we could frame it through vulnerability. Regardless of exactly how we, or what we contain in this tag that is gender-based violence, what we can understand is how vulnerability compounds. We talk a lot about the continuum of violence when we talk about Venezuelan migration, and some of that violence is definitely structural, and some of it qualifies as what we would call gender-based violence, but it doesn't really matter when we see it through the focus of compounding vulnerability and understanding that whatever makes up that basis is only increased through migration routes. It's only increased, like whatever pre-existing vulnerabilities exist will only be that much worse in a displacement context. And that is where we should be coming at this from, without so much individual regard of the components, but just the general trend of how this builds up and creates increasing risks for migrants.
And I think we can all agree that nation-based violence puts all women in a vulnerable position.
Sure.
Thank you all. This was fantastic.
Thank you.
Lara.
Yeah.
It is very difficult to find concluding remarks to a panel on gender-based violence, because what is there to say that's uplifting? So I would like to just share what I leave this event knowing with after having learned from our experts today. One, while challenges remain, there are practices and people, including our panelists, out there that are working tirelessly on addressing gender-based violence in displacement contexts. Two, tools and approaches exist that have proven to be effective in gender-based violence prevention, mitigation, and response. And so we must use them in a targeted way. We must use them in collaboration, and we must use them in partnership. And third, it is events like this today that bring us together to better understand how gender-based violence manifests, which forms of gender-based violence are particularly prevalent, and what spaces are considered high risk. And so this knowledge is truly invaluable and allows us to collectively aim at ending gender-based violence once and for all. And so with this, I say thank you to Dean Mostov for moderating this insightful discussion. Thanks to my dear colleagues, Cristina, Katherine, and Isha specifically, as I would like to note here as well that Isha is one of the selected Gender Equality Fellows of the UNCSW of this year. And it's absolutely fantastic to have youth perspectives on a panel and to see what migrant youth is doing within their capacities. And of course, that I've had the pleasure of working with Isha for 3 years now at the Center for Migration, Gender, and Justice. So with this, I would also like to say, let's keep these conversations going and for you to join us for the rest of the week of the first Global Gender and Migration Forum. With this, I say, see you tomorrow.